What will it change? In historical context, nothing. More than that, we know the stance and the statements of the U.S. leadership about the active confrontation military actions in the east of Ukraine would not stop Ukraine to join NATO if it will correspond to the criteria of the NATO Charter and if they can overcome corruption. And they try to convince us that NATO is a peaceful and defensive bloc, so there is no threat for Russia. And they, again, suggest we believe their words, but we already know the value of such words. Back in 1990, when we talked about uniting Germany, the USA promised to the Soviet leadership that neither jurisdiction nor military presence would not move an inch to the east, and unification of Germany would not lead to the eastward expansion of NATO. And I'm quoting here, so and it's their bravery allowed it to add the city to Russia. Back then, in the 18th century, the Black Sea coastlands that were got from Turkey, from Ottoman Empire, was given name Novorossiya. Now they want to forget this name, like they want to forget the deeds of the famous commanders, without which Ukraine itself wouldn't have access to the Black Sea. Recently in Poltava, they demolished the monument to Alexander Suvorov. Well, what can I say? You are renouncing your own path, the so-called colonial legacy of the Soviet Empire. Well, be consistent then. Article 17 of the Constitution of Ukraine doesn't allow military bases of foreign states to be deployed in their territory, but it seems that it can be bypassed. They have deployed training missions of the NATO countries in Ukraine. Basically, that's a military base already. They just call it a mission, and it's done. In Kiev, they have long declared strategic aim at joining NATO. Yes, obviously, every country has the right to choose their own alliances, to sign military agreements. That's true, but there is one. But in international law, it says there is a principle of indivisible security, which states that one country cannot enhance its security at the expense of security of others. And I can refer here to the European Security OSCE Charter that was adopted in Istanbul in 1999 and Astana OSCE Declaration from 2010. In other words, choosing means to enhance one's security should not create any threats for other states, and if Ukraine was to join NATO, would serve as a direct threat to the security of Russia. And I would remind you, back in April of 2018 at the Bucharest summit of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, USA forced these members to make a decision that certain states were to join NATO. A lot of European allies already back then understood all the risks of such a step, but they had to subdue to the will of their older partner. Americans used them to pursue anti-Russian policy. Some NATO members still and our American counterparts are saying the same. We say, okay, it is not going to happen tomorrow, but the day after tomorrow then. What will it change? In historical context, nothing. More than that, we know the stance and the statements of the U.S. leadership about the active confrontation military actions in the east of Ukraine would not stop Ukraine to join NATO if it will correspond to the criteria of the NATO Charter and if they can overcome corruption. And they try to convince us that NATO is a peaceful and defensive bloc, so there is no threat for Russia. And they, again, suggest we believe their words, but we already know the value of such words. Back in 1990, when we talked about uniting Germany, the USA promised to the Soviet leadership that neither jurisdiction nor military presence would not move an inch to the east, and unification of Germany would not lead to the eastward expansion of NATO. And I'm quoting here, so they were first of all, and it was happening back in the 1990s and early 2000s when, because of the openness and goodwill, our goodwill, relations between Russia and the West were at high level. Russia fulfilled all its obligations, withdrew troops from Germany, from the Central and Eastern European countries, and it made a huge contribution in overcoming the legacy of the Cold War. We consistently suggested all kinds of cooperation, including in the format of the Russian NATO Council and OSCE. More than that, I will say one thing that I have never said before in public. I will say it for the first time. Back in 2000, when President Bill Clinton was visiting Moscow at the end of his term, I asked him, how would America see Russia joining NATO? I would not give you all the details of that conversation, but the reaction to my conversation looked, well, very reserved, let me put it this way. And how did Americans really look at this possibility? You can see it in their practical steps in regard of our country. Open support of the terrorists in North Caucasus, ignoring our demands and our concerns in the security area, withdrawing from the treaties, arms treaties, and so on and so forth. It still begs the question, why? Why did they do that? What for? Okay, you don't want to see a friend in us, an ally in us, but why do you want to make an enemy out of us? The only answer that we got was, it's not about our political regime or anything else, it's just they don't need such a big and independent country as Russia. So that's the answer to all the question. That's the source of traditional American policy they pursue in the Russian track. That's why they react like this to all our proposals. Again, that there will be a bigger threat of immediate attack against our country. In American strategic documents, in their doctrine, there is such a possibility of preventive work against the missile complexes of the adversary. And who is the main adversary of the United States? We all know that, Russia. In NATO documents, our country is officially, directly called a main threat to the North Atlantic security. And Ukraine will serve as the platform for such an offense. If our ancestors heard about that, they would probably thought that it's impossible. We don't want to believe that either, but that's how it is now. I want people from Russia and Ukraine to understand that. Many Ukrainian airfields are positioned close to our borders, and strategic NATO airplanes using high-precision weapons can strike targets in Volgograd, Samar, and Kazan and Astrakhan. Using reconnaissance tool will allow NATO to control the airspace of Russia up until the Urals. And finally, after the US withdrew from the INF Treaty, the Pentagon has openly started developing a whole range of the land-based missiles with a range of 5,500 kilometers. If such systems are deployed in Ukraine, they can hit the targets in the European Russia and also behind the Urals. And the travel time of the Tomahawk missiles to Moscow will be less than 35 minutes. Ballistic missiles, 7-8 minutes. And the hypersonic offensive weapons, 4-5 minutes. That's like having a knife against our throat. And I have no doubt they plan to implement these ideas. And as it has been done previously when they expanded NATO to the east, moving infrastructure, military infrastructure closer to our borders. ignoring our protests and our warnings. They just didn't care about that. They did whatever they deemed necessary and appropriate. And I believe they global stability. Back in 2008, Russia has come up with an initiative on signing an agreement about European security, and its gist was that no state, no international organization at European Atlantic could not enhance its security at the expense of security of others. But our suggestion was refuted from the get-go because we can't allow Russia to limit the activities of NATO. We were told that legally binding guarantees of security, only NATO members can have such guarantees. And last December, we have sent our partners the draft document about security guarantees and also the draft agreement on the measures of enhancing Russian security and NATO member security. In response, NATO members and the US were saying a lot of words. There was some reasonable ideas, but they were talking only about secondary things. And it looked as an attempt to bring this discussion away from the main point, and we reacted in kind. I would like to emphasize that we are ready to negotiate, but only on the condition that all matters will be considered as a package, in complex, without going away from the main proposals made by Russia. And those have three main items. Firstly, non-expansion of NATO to the east, non-deployment of offensive weapons next to the Russian borders, and finally, bringing back the military infrastructure back to the Confederation of 1997 when the founding act was signed between Russia and NATO. These principled proposals were ignored. Our Western partners, once again, they were saying same old words that every state has freedom to choose ways to enhance its security, to provide its security, to join any military alliances. So nothing changed in their position. They talk about the same open doors policy. More than that, once again, they try to blackmail us. Once again, they threaten us with sanctions. And I think they will still impose those, introduce those as strong and as more powerful our country becomes. They will always find an excuse to introduce more sanctions, regardless of the situation in Ukraine, that is. The only goal they have is to contain the development of Russia. And they will do that like they did it before, without any formal excuse, only because we exist. And we will never concede our sovereignty, our national interest, and our values. And I want to be frank. In the current situation, when our proposals about equitable dialogue about principal matters had no response from the US and NATO, when the level of threat for our country is becoming greater and greater, Russia has every right to take countermeasures to enhance our own security. And that's how we plan to act. As for situation in Donbass, we can see that the Kiev elite keeps stating publicly about lack of willingness to implement the Minsk agreements to settle the conflict. They are not interested in peaceful resolution. Vice versa, they want to start blitzkrieg, like it happened back in 2014 and 2015. And you remember how it ended. Now almost every day they are shelling settlements in Donbass. They have amassed large troops. They are using offensive unmanned vehicles and other heavy machinery, torturing people, children, women, elderly people. It doesn't stop, it doesn't cease. We see no end to it. And the so-called civilized world, nationalism, Stone Age nationalism and Nazism, and they want to defend their basic rights to live on their land, to speak their native language, to preserve their traditions and their culture. How much longer that could go on? How much longer can they bear it? Russia did everything it could to keep the territorial integrity of Ukraine. We tried hard to implement the resolution of the Security Council of UN 2202 that endorsed the Minsk agreements on resolving the situation in Donbass, but everything was done in vain. The presidents are changing, the parliament members are changing, but the idea of the aggressive regime is still the same, regime that seized the power in Kyiv. It was created by the coup d'etat of 2014, and those who chose the way of violence, they admit they see no other way to resolve the Donbas crisis other than the military way. In this regard, I deem it necessary to make a decision that should have been made a long time ago, to immediately recognize the independence and sovereignty of Donetsk People's Republic and Lugansk People's Republic. And I would like to request the Federal Assembly to support, to back this decision and ratify the agreement of friendship and mutual help with both republics. We will draft this document and sign these documents in the near future. And those who seize the power and keep the power in Kyiv, we demand to stop hostilities immediately. Otherwise, all the responsibility for the possible continuation of the bloodbath will be on the consciousness of the regime that is ruling in Kyiv. By declaring these decisions, I'm confident that I will have support of the people